Hello and welcome to Chapter 12, The Making of Europe. So, the Roman Empire, as we all know, collapses in the mid-400s AD. And after that, what happens in the East? Excellent. The Byzantine Empire stays around as an Orthodox, well, they become Orthodox later after the Great Schism, but before that, the Roman Empire is taken, or the Western Roman Empire is taken over by Germanic kingdoms. And so that kind of sets the stage for what Europe will become. So, you have the Franks and what becomes France, and then the Burgundians and what becomes Burgundy, which is later taken over by the French, and then similar things like that. So that's like the 500s, 600s, 700s, some of the Germanic kingdoms in Europe. A lot of the Germanic kingdoms are taken over during the Islamic conquests. So the Byzantines are pushed into Anatolia, Greece, as we've talked about before, and Persia's taken over and all that. But now you have the Islamic Empire comes into Europe, and after the Battle of Tours, there's a bigger amount of centralization. A lot of the Germanic kingdoms had been in North Africa and Spain prior to the Islamic conquest. And the Islamic conquest was a very centralizing thing in Europe because you can't all be fighting against each other, because now there's sort of an existential threat going on, and you have the Vikings are coming out of Denmark and Norway, which is wreaking havoc in England and Ireland and stuff like that. So there's a lot of pressures which are forcing the centralization of the state a little bit more, but that comes later. So now you have the early, like the prototype of the Kingdom of France in the form of the Franks. But the Franks, under actually Charles Martel's grandson Charlemagne, take over a fair amount of territory, like northern Italy, Germany. So a big country, and they beat the Muslims a few times. The Song of Roland is about that. And so now you have. Okay, so what happens is the Emperor of the Byzantine Empire is kind of viewed by the Pope, and the Pope is the Bishop of Rome, because remember now Europe is Christian. The Emperor of Rome, or the Emperor of the Byzantines, is now a woman. So the Pope is kind of like, well, I don't really want to do that. So they take that opportunity to make Charlemagne, who's the king of the Franks and who has recently given lands to the papacy, the Pope decides to make him the new Roman emperor, and the Byzantines aren't too keen on that, but what can they really do? So now that is called the Holy Roman Empire, and that will stick around in Europe for a while in varying forms. So now you have the Holy Roman Empire, and eventually, when Charlemagne dies, the western part kind of splits off, and that will become the prototype for France, or early France. And you have Germany will become kind of the core for the Holy Roman Empire throughout the Middle Ages. So what is going on in Europe in this medieval period? This is what we think of like serfs and castles and stuff like that. So, you'll have a lord, and they'll have serfs working their land, and they'll have knights defending their lands, and then when the king asks them, to rally to fight an invading army, they'll, get their knights together, or they'll have levies of serfs. So not a hyper-advanced state, and the church is kind of above it all. Because remember, the Catholic Church kind of fills the void of the overarching, what the Romans had been, something kind of binding all the more local areas together. So then you have the Reconquista, so the Christians in Spain are able to kick out or remove the Muslims from Spain after the conquest in the 700s, and the final Muslims are kicked out of Spain in 1492, which everybody should remember is another big year in world history. And then you have, before that, there was kind of a shift, especially after the Black Death. So many serfs had died that their work became kind of premium, so they were able to request more rights for themselves, stuff like town charters. So now there are towns forming, and then towns trade with each other. So that's the rise of the burghers. And the burghers are people who live in towns and are like artisans and have groups of artisans get together, and those are guilds, and that's the beginning of the end of feudalism in Europe, because now there's inter-town commerce and stuff is getting more advanced. So you have lots of cool kingdoms going on, and another thing that kind of pops up is monks and orders of monks, Dominicans, Franciscans, stuff like that. And those are groups of Catholic men, and then you have abbotesses and nunneries for women, Catholics who can come together and they're living in the same place, and they're learning and praying and stuff like that. And those are very important for the preservation of Roman literature and stuff like that in a post-Roman world, because the monks painstakingly rewrite books that the Romans had and recopy. And a lot of the stuff we have from the Romans, there's stuff that the Byzantines held on to, but a lot of the stuff we have from the Romans are stuff that these monks recopied, and then, even though the original source is lost, we have the copies made of them. And they're just important centers of scholarly learning. Charlemagne pushed for, when the Holy Roman Empire was more unified, he pushed for learning throughout his empire, and he does that through the church and stuff like that. So, yeah. Yep. And then you have some barbarian invasions into Europe. The main one is the Hungarians, the Proto-Hungarians, the Magyars, come into Europe, and they set up a kingdom that will prove to be pretty large. And yeah, so that's roughly Europe throughout the Middle Ages. And then we talked about, when the Mongols take over all of Europe, or all of Asia, pardon, one of the things they take over is what is today Russia. And so this kingdom, and in doing that, they take over the proto-Russian state, the Principality of Rus. And so that's part of why Russia later on would seem to be behind Europe, was they had been taken over and treated very roughly by their conquerors. So the Russians don't get independence until about the 1400s or so, and that's out there. Yep. And yeah. And so, we talked about the Crusades a little bit, but these new European kingdoms, as the Byzantine Empire is coming to its end, or getting kind of hemmed in, Byzantines ask for help from the Europeans. The Pope says yes, so they send armies of knights and such to retake Jerusalem, and they retake Jerusalem, but then are later, kicked back out. And they're not exactly retaking it, because it had been Byzantine before, and they weren't giving it back to the Byzantine. So it was a whole thing. And they actually, even though they started the Crusades to help the Byzantines in 1204, they sacked Constantinople and destroyed the Byzantine Empire. Well, later it comes back, it's in a much more weakened form. So Crusades are kind of all over the place in whether or not they accomplish their goals. But one of the interesting things that happens is it exposes the West, the post-Roman West, to the East, and say Byzantine knowledge and the goods and stuff like that, and Islamic knowledge and the goods coming from the Far East. So it kind of sets up the stage for the 1400s and exploration and stuff like that. All right, that's all for today. Thanks for tuning in.